Hello everyone, my name is Luke Whitehead and welcome back to the Coach David Lemon Ultimate YouTube channel. Today we're going to be going over the LMGT3 daily races for this week. Let's get into it. So, first things first, we have the LMGT3 Sprint Cup races, which are going to be held at Qatar WEC layout in the night time. So, the main thing to consider when going through this track is patience on the throttle. You know, there's a lot of gravel exits, which mean that if you get too impatient on the throttle, the car will just understeer wide and you can get on the gravel, and that will either spin you out or it will lose just a lot of time. So that's the main thing to go into, looking into this lap. But without further ado, let's get into the in-depth guide. So, coming down towards turn 1, you've got quite a lot of reference points into this corner. You've got the 50-meter board on the left-hand side. You've got that camera pole, which you can see straight ahead of us now on the right-hand side. You've got also the Rolex board if that doesn't get taken out, but you've also got that white line on the floor as well. So you've got quite a lot of references, thankfully, for turn 1. You want to brake just before these, so around 60 or 70 meters. Then gear 2, aiming to get onto this red and white curb on the inside. You can try and dip a wheel onto the orange, but be very cautious that if you take even a little bit too much orange, you will invalidate with the left side tyres going across the white line. So be very, very wary that, you know, taking the red and white is probably the safest bet. And, you know, it enables you to get a good hook round. But if you're, you know, pushing for quali and you're, you know, if you've got a good banker in and you're wanting to push that a little bit harder, you can risk with a wheel on the orange. Get back to the throttle. Letting the car run out pretty much to the white line. But, again, it's better if you can hold it a bit narrower because it leaves you less work to do to get the car over to the right-hand side again for turn 2. Fortunately, we managed to get over just in time. Braking at the middle of this curb on the right-hand side down to gear 2. Turning in nice and late, turning in pretty much to the end of the entry curb. Hitting the apex mid-corner, putting 1 or 2 wheels on the orange on the left-hand side. Really hooking that curb, but then get back to throttle. Keeping the car relatively narrow on the exit. You can see we don't even use that exit curb. There, we're just on the white line. And then we go through this pretty easy right-hander. And now, that is the end of Sector 1. Now into Sector 2. Use a lot of this entry curb. We're pretty much using all of it on the left-hand side. Brake just at this DHL board or the white line on the floor, whichever reference is better for you. And obviously which reference is there, because the DHL board will probably get taken out at some point. Down to gear 3, you can usually take this in gear 2 as well, but I find just carrying a slightly higher gear helps you roll through the first part, because I think the first part is deceptively difficult. You have to roll through quite a bit of speed. To let the car run out naturally to the curb, you can see we run the car out nice and wide on the exit. Not too wide because we don't want to touch the gravel on the left. And speaking of gravel, we turn in just after that disappears. Have a slight coasting phase through here. Get back on the throttle at the apex to make sure we don't understeer off onto the gravel again here, because that will lose you a lot of lap time. And now bring the car right over to the right hand side, braking just after this white line on the right, or I tend to use I don't know if you can see it, the that lamppost on the left, so the right hand one. Usually that goes out of view just as you start braking. So you can see here it just appeared on the A pillar, but on my FOV, usually I see that go past my screen, and that's when I brake. Down to gear 1. Trailing nice and deep, getting back on the throttle nice and late round the corner, because again, you don't want to understeer wide and invalidate the lap. Now bring the car over to the left hand side. You want to brake just after this white pole on the right hand side. Sort of in between that and the start of the apex curb. Down to gear 2. Getting the car in nice and early, hooking the right hand curb. Getting back on the throttle, letting the car run out nice and wide on the left, but again, not too wide because we can easily invalidate if you put your right wheels over the white line. And now, again, bring the car back over to the left-hand side. Again, not too much because you'll invalidate on the curb. Making sure to prioritise this right-hander, the right-hander exit, I should say, to keep the car nice and narrow. You can see we keep the car just around the middle of the circuit, leaving a lot of room to the left-hand side, just so that we give ourselves way less work to do to get the car over to the right-hand side. Because the next corner, you want to prioritise the exit, because the exit means quite a lot of this circuit. Down to gear 2. Again, wait until we get to the inside curb. We get back on the throttle. Bit of kick of oversteer there, as we are running quite a high differential setting at this track in most cars, just to get that rotation on the throttle because of how long and how curved the exit phases usually are for most corners. Minimum amount of exit curb here. You want to try and avoid it because the TC can cut in very hard over that curb. The curb is very, very rough. And then shortest line possible to the left-hand side. and then towards the very, very difficult triple right-hander. I'm going to get a bit of braking done on the entry, use the throttle mid-corner to stabilise the rear, but for the most part you want to try and coast as much as possible and just let the car do its thing. Again, coasting here, we overshoot a little bit. We had to be very hesitant on the throttle, as you can see. Ideally, you want to put your right wheel on the orange, but we unfortunately missed that. And then you can see we're very, very close to getting on the gravel. Fortunately, we keep off the gravel. And then dab the brake just after the gravel ends, down a gear. Getting back on the throttle there as we hit the orange. And then bring the car right over to the right side again, braking just after this Michelin, or just before this Michelin board, or the white line, whichever reference is better, or whichever reference is still there. Again, down to third, back on the throttle as we hit the curb on the inside. And now, final corner. It's a deceptively difficult braking zone. Braking at the 50-meter board. Down towards gear 2. Turning in quite late, but hooking up one wheel on the pinkish red tarmac on the inside. As you can see here, yeah, we've got our inside wheels hooked on there. Back to full throttle, let the car run out. Again, left wheels just on the pink tarmac. And that is a lap of Qatar. Now that we've gone through the lap in new view form, let's have a look at how that looks in the Coach Dave Delta app. So here we are on the Coach Dave Delta app, looking at our fastest lap time that we did, the 1:55.035, on the around 14 laps of fuel, I believe it was. I just wanted to highlight the coasting phase that I mentioned a lot of this lap. Obviously, it's a very, very flowing track. You know, a lot of high-speed corners, a lot of very long corners. But the coasting is a massive thing. And we're going to be looking at the red and green traces exclusively. These yellow ones are... I'm not actually sure where they're from, but they're completely out of sync. So they're not relevant to this. So make sure to keep an eye on the highly, the lit traces, so to speak. So I'll first start off with turn 4, I believe it is, the double right-hander at the start of sector 2. You can see we're braking off the brake. You can see already we're coasting. Considering it's a very short corner, we are coasting pretty much the entirety of that corner. You can see in the map just above me, basically where the line is greyed out is where we're actually coasting. And you can see through this entire apex phase until we get pretty much out the corner, we're not touching the brake or the throttle. And again, same here. We're coasting all the way on the entry and then getting back on the throttle. And again, because these corners are so, flowing and quite long apexed, despite these corners being quite short in the grand scheme of things, they have very long apexes. So you've got to be very, very patient and let the car do its thing in the middle of the corner. Especially since, if you go too early on the throttle or you are rushing the car to do its thing, you will just understeer onto the gravel, and that can cause so much time loss and even invalidate even with that time loss. So it is very, very crucial to make sure that you're letting the car do its thing, kind of treating every corner like you would at Pouon, for example, at Spa. It's just coasting through the corner, letting the car really work on its own and not trying to force any issue through there. And again, through this hairpin, long coasting phase. Again here, long coasting phase. So just across the lap, we're just being really patient, not trying to force the issue. Coasting a lot, letting the car go through in as much of a stable state as you can. Especially through this triple right-hander here. You can see we're really only using the throttle, using a bit of brake on entry, a bit of brake here, a bit of brake there. But it's only a few percent really. Not even a quarter brake. And then we're just back on the throttle again. Just letting the car go through, trying to make it pitch as little as possible. And that's really important because if you try and go into one of these high-speed corners, slam the brake and pitch the front, really downwards, the car will just spin. And it is so sketchy through that section. You just got to let the car be, as stable as possible. It's really, really important. So, for this NG3 Sprint Cup race, what do we need to consider this week? So, first and foremost, it's a 20-minute sprint race, so lights to flag, no pit stops needed, no real tyre consumption or fuel consumption saving needed. You go around 14 laps of fuel, and you're easily a couple of laps safe. I believe it was 11 or 12 laps that I worked out that would be the maximum. So, if you do that, you should be around fine, around 55% energy, roughly should be completely safe. As for car choice, it's Qatar, so any car with a strong aero platform, be it the Ferrari, the Porsche, the Lambo, should be very strong. And obviously because it's at night time, it's going to be very cold. So the cars that have hotter tyre temperatures generally are going to be more useful in these races than they would normally. So, the Corvette, the Lambo, the Ferrari. You know, those sort of cars are going to be a lot more prevalent in this race than they would normally. So I'd say just the high aero cars, you know, the Lamborghini is probably the top pick, I'd say. Then the Ferrari, Corvette, those sort of cars. I think the Merc is also going to be a pretty good shoe-in as well, along with the Porsche. But it's just going to be mainly the cars that rotate a lot and that have a lot of high speed, cornering speed. For WEC Experience this week, we have Silverstone in a very cloudy weather setting. So let's get into what we need to do for this lap. So coming down towards turn 1, at Cops, we have 2 braking markers. We have the Goodyear boards on the left, which will probably be gone during the race. But you also have this this barrier on the right hand side, where the sort of Armco starts and the red barrier ends. Although it's not quite in line with the Goodyear board, it's relatively close, which means you can still use it as a reference point. But for this, you brake just before those, so just before the Goodyear board and just before this barrier. Down a gear, trying to hit the inside curb. We unfortunately take a little bit too much, so we take the red and red sausages on the right hand side. Ideally, you don't really want to be doing this. You want to be just taking the black and white curb. But if you take the sausage, it's not a huge issue. It doesn't unsettle the cars too much through here. But the main consideration is that we're able to get nice rotation on the curb, get back on the throttle nice and early, but keep the car within track limits, which we do nicely on the exit of Cops. Now coming towards Magus, Beckers and Chapel. It's very important to get the braking done in a straight line, because if you brake while trying to turn in, the car will snap, and the car is very, very sketchy through here, particularly the Ferrari. But I found the same in most other cars as well. You're going to try and get the braking done in a straight line, get back on the throttle through the cornering phase to keep the car stable. And sure enough, slight dab of the brake, back on the throttle as we're turning in. Keeping the car relatively far to the right hand side as much as possible to set up the left and Chapel, the final right hander. Getting back on the throttle again, taking just enough curb on the left hand side, but not too much, because you don't want to invalidate. We actually got extremely close, less than half a tyre to invalidating. Luckily we kept on the track limit though. Keeping the car again as far to the left hand side as we can without compromising too much. Hooking the inside right curb, getting back on the throttle mid corner, and let the car run out nicely. But again, if you run out too far, you'll get in the grass, you'll get a bad exit as a result, and you might invalidate your lap. So just make sure you prioritise the exit, but don't invalidate. And as you can see, because we prioritise a good exit, we can keep the car nice to the left hand side, the shortest possible line, now down towards Stowe corner. Getting to around 253, 254 kph, now braking into Stowe just before this curb. So you want to try and point the car up ever so slightly towards the inside of the corner. As you can see, we're not braking parallel to the curb, we're braking slightly inwards. And because if you try and brake too wide, you'll be off the grip as you get to the corner, and you just lose all the grip that you have on the rubber. You can see we're going nicely, letting the car go in, just hitting the curb at the midpoint of the corner, getting back on the throttle, making sure not to get too wide on the exit curb. We get a relatively straight exit and don't get anywhere near invalidating, which is nice. You kind of want to aim to exit just after this anti-cut on the left ends. And you see we do that perfectly. And now, down towards club. Braking just at the start of this entry curb. Down to gear 1. We go in slightly deep. Ideally, you want to take the red curb on the left-hand side as well. Unfortunately, we go slightly too wide. But we do still manage to get the apex nicely enough, which means we can keep the car to the left-hand side. Short shift up to gear 2 for better traction, and then we just wait. Wait a long time before getting back on the throttle. Getting full back to throttle, using the TC override to get a smooth exit without losing traction. And now down towards Abbey. Probably the most frustrating corner in the entirety of the circuit, because the car just does not want to do what you want it to through here. It either slides too wide on the rear or understeers too much on the front. It's really frustrating. So you've got to take this corner quite smooth, take it quite patient, and just let the car do its thing. Similar to how I mentioned in Qatar, and also similar to how I mentioned in Maggots, Beckers and Chapel. You want to try and get the braking done in a straight line, use the throttle to stabilise the car, but ultimately don't do too much that's going to unsettle the car. You can see, slight tap of the brake, back to the throttle as soon as we're turning in, downshift, but again, we're using a lot of throttle just to keep the weight on the rear. Keep the car, bring the car back over to the right hand side ever so slightly, which means we can get on this curb on the left hand side, which hooks us round, keeps us only in the middle of the circuit, which means we don't have to rush to get the car all the way over from the right back to the left of the village. It means we can get over to the white line nice and easy. You can see we brake just at the start of that curb, pointed towards the entry curb, down to gear 2, and then trailing in, hitting the right hand curb but not taking the sausage, because if you take the sausage you just understeer wide, or you get really bad traction, so make sure to hit the curb but not the sausage curb. Back to throttle, keeping the car not too wide. You can run the car out nice and wide, but you got to make sure that you can bring the car back over to the right hand side, which we managed to do on this occasion. Down to gear 1, throwing the car in quite aggressively through here. This is one of the sections on the track where you actually have to be quite assertive with the car, because you're so grip limited, especially in the Ferrari, which doesn't have a lot of mechanical grip. You can see we chuck the car into the left hand side, into the left hand hairpin, sorry. Down to gear 1, back on the throttle as we hit the midpoint of the corner. You can actually see, if we go out to the outside camera, you see we're almost at the midpoint while we're getting... Actually, no, we are on the midpoint. I just can't get the camera right. There we go. In the midpoint of the corner, back to the throttle. Let the car run out nicely, but not on the exit curb, because you get really bad traction if you do that. And now, down towards Brooklands. This corner I didn't get particularly nice on this lap, unfortunately. I overslowed a bit. It's because the braking point is quite irritating. It's quite hard to spot your reference point. But the reference we use is that digiboard on the right hand side, the barrier changing colour from silver to red, and that bigger building on the right hand side. Use one of the 3 references or all 3 at once, whichever works for you. But unfortunately I broke a little bit too early on this lap. You can see we broke as the red kind of disappears beyond our vision. Down to gear 2. And you can see here we turn in a bit early, braking a bit too slow, and which means we hit the sausage curb on the left hand side. Ideally, you don't want to hit these sausages. You just want to keep the left-hand wheels on the black and white curb. But fortunately, we don't bounce too badly. We only lose a few hundredths. And now coming into Luffield, braking nice and early here, braking just after this sausage curb on the right-hand side. Then keeping it in 2, trying to V the corner off a little bit, but keeping the car, relatively tight. We only run out about half a car width. And then back to the throttle as early as possible. Letting the car run out to the green on the left-hand side. And that is a lap of Silverstone. There are a couple of things I want to go over and emphasise using Coach Dave Delta app. So let's get into that now. Here we are on Coach Dave Delta again. I wanted to go over the 158.7 that we did on race fuel. I wanted to kind of analyse the dichotomy in corners in Silverstone. Obviously, we have a lot of high-speed corners in Sector 1. But then, of course, we have a lot of low-speed corners in Sector 2 and 3. And I wanted to kind of go over how differently you have to approach those corners on this lap. Because obviously, in the setup, you're going to have to compromise one area or the other. You can't have super good high-speed performance, but also good low-speed performance. Oftentimes you're having to compromise one or the other and make up for the rest with your driving. And that is also the case on this lap. So if we go to Cops, for example, you can see we have that really short braking, input, back to the throttle very, very soon and very, very quickly. But you can see the steering input that we make, if we just look at the graph on its own. You can see for the first steering input here, we're quite smooth. We're not using a huge amount of steering. Yeah, the initial input is quite sharp, but the steering as a whole, we're only around 22% steering to the right. So not a lot of steering input that we're using. Same for Maggots, Beckett's and Chapel. You can see we have that spike of braking as we're straight. And then we're smoothly applying the right hand steering. Then going back to straight again as we hit the brake. And then turning into the left using the throttle as we're turning in. And that's the same for the first part of Maggots as well. And then a bit of a sharper steering input to the right hand side again. But again, back to the throttle as we're getting through that corner to stabilize the rear. So you can see we're being relatively smooth. Assertive, so we are being quite sharp with our inputs. But we're still being relatively smooth, not using hugely aggressive inputs. And that's kind of the main thing I wanted to go over for the high-speed stuff. Same for Abbey as well. If we go to here, you can see we have that really small brake input. Back to throttle, and you can see very, very smooth curving steering trace here. Where my cursor is. But then we compare it to the low speeds corners. So we go to Club, for example. You can see we have that really aggressive brake. And as we're trailing off the brake, that's when we start turning in. You can see we slam the steering to the left and then slam it again to the right. 30% to 35, nearly 40% to the left. And then again, 35% to the right. So we're really going left, then right. A lot more aggressive at low speeds, making the car work. And then again, directly opposed to Abbey, the very next corner, where we're super smooth. Really slowly moving the input from right to left. And then we go into Village, slam the brake, and as we're trailing in the brake, that's when we start steering in. You can see slamming the steering in, 39 to 40% steering right. So we've just gone whack the steering in at low speed. And again, second part is exactly the same. We go to straight steering, brake, and then turn. You can see we throw the steering in 45% steering left. So at the low speed, we're throwing the car in a lot more aggressively through these short apex corners. So it's a massive, massive dichotomy that you don't get at a lot of different tracks. But at Silverstone, it is a very big thing. Because obviously you have these short apex corners like Club and Village where you have to throw the car in at low speed. But then, of course, you have the longer corners at low speed as well, like Brooklands and Luffield, where you are still being quite smooth with your inputs. Because obviously the corner is a lot longer. But these short apex corners at the slower speed, you've got to really work the car. And I'm glad I'm able to show that in Coach Dave Delta, because it is quite hard to see and quite hard to think about without looking at the steering traces. So let's see what else you have to consider for this daily race this week. WEC Experience is a 2 times energy consumption race. It's a 40-minute race, which means that you will have to make a pit stop. You get around 13 laps of virtual energy by default, which means that you'll probably get to around 25, 26 minutes of the race. So you will need to pit with around 15 or so minutes to go. So it's important to note that unless you do any lifting coasting, that is the kind of situation you will be in for the race. With regards to car choices, honestly, it's pretty open. I think the Lexus is obviously a very good pick. It looks very quick at Silverstone and obviously has very good tyre wear. And there will be tyre wear at play in this race. Obviously, it's a 40-minute one, so almost a full length stint if you're thinking about not changing tyres in the pit stop. And then, of course, you've got the other cars like the Ford, which is pretty decent. The Lamborghini seems very quick. And obviously, with the conditions being very cold, the Lamborghini will be a very good shout as well. Additionally, the Corvette will be a very, very fast shout. It's a very, very quick car on raw pace. And obviously, with the cold temps, with these weather configurations being there, it'll be a very good pick as well. So you're pretty open to choices. But I think my top 3 cars would be the Lexus, the Corvette, and potentially the Lambo. I think the Porsche will also be very strong as well. But just we'll see how it goes. Sometimes my predictions have been very far off. So let's see what the LMGT3 fixed races have in store for us this week then. For the LMGT3 fixed races, we have a very, very warm temperature at Le Mans. So it's around 27 degrees ambient temperature, I believe, and around 40 degrees track temp. And obviously with tyre warmers, it's going to be very, very brutal. You're going to run out of grip very, very quickly. So let's see what a very overheating Le Mans lap looks like on a fixed setup. So lots of understeer. Let's get into it. Coming into turn 1, you want to turn in a little bit earlier than you would normally. So I use that sort of that white line on the left-hand side, just as we run over it. I also turn in just after that. Try and aim for this inside curb, but not hooking it on the green, because otherwise you'll basically spin the car. Try and hook this curb a little bit to try and keep the car over to the right-hand side. We don't succeed fully, but you know, it's better than being all the way out to the left-hand side. And then for braking, we use that white line on the ground and that Total Energies board, the sign, as braking. Down to gear 2. Turn in nice and late. Try and hook the inside curb. I didn't quite hook it enough, but it's okay because we still got relatively far to the left-hand side. So prioritise the exit under the Dunlop Bridge. You can see nice and early picking up the throttle. Get a nice smooth exit. And now coming through this right-hander. Into the left, you want to brake in a straight line, midway between the end of this tarmac on the right-hand side and the excess road further down. And brake pretty much directly between them. Down to gear 3. Get back on the throttle only when the car is fully rotated in the camber. So pretty much at the bump on the apex here. Back to throttle. We have a slight lift just to keep the front, not from boating wide. And now into Tetra Rouge. You want to have a slight brake just after this BMW board on the right-hand side. Or just in line with that where the curb kind of roughens up around where my cursor is. Keep it in 4th gear. Back on the throttle as we hit the curb. Make sure not to invalidate. And the exit is super, super crucial because you've got a long straight down towards the first chicane on the Mulsanne straight. And down the middle of the circuit to prevent bottoming or have less bottoming. And now coming into the first chicane, you want to brake just after this bump on the left-hand side towards the 100-meter board. Down to gear 2. Again, you want to prioritise exit here, so keep the car far to the right-hand side. Slow the car down on the left. Get back on the throttle nice and early. We run a little bit wide because the car on this setup really doesn't ride the curves very well. We get a nice enough exit. We don't lose too much time. Now again, down the second part of the Mulsanne straight. Similar principle to the first chicane. You want to prioritise the exit. So you want to brake just at the 100-meter board. Down to gear 2. Hook the left-hand curb nicely to make sure you set up the right-hander. Get back on the throttle as you hit the curb. And then get a nice smooth exit, keeping it within track limits crucially. It's very important, as I said, to prioritise your exit. Slow in and fast out is a massive principle that you want to follow for those chicanes. And now, again, another very slow in, fast out corner. Don't be fooled by the second sector split whenever you do a lap, because the second sector split is basically on the apex of this right-hander. So if you go in a bit too deep, you'll have a faster sector 2 and a much slower sector 3. But regardless, you want to prioritise your exit as much as possible. So you brake just at the corner of this curb. Let the car run out over the white line, down to gear 1. Hook the right-hand curb, get back on the throttle, pretty much as we hit the apex there. Let the car run out, not on the gravel though, because if you run out onto the gravel, you'll have a bad exit all the way up this long straight, and it will massively inhibit your exit. We go to the middle line, again, similar to the Mulsanne straight, to prevent bottoming. But then, since this straight isn't actually straight, you have a couple of corners here, a couple of kinks. You want to straddle the curb or get as close to the curb as you can, just to have a shorter exit or a shorter line down towards Indianapolis corner. And now, coming into Indianapolis corner, you want to make the way over to the left-hand side. Downshift on the green, so just towards the end of the green. Or we actually just lift off, actually. Have a dab on the brakes. Most cars you will downshift. And then braking at the excess road on the right-hand side. Down to gear 2. Hooking the inside curb for a little bit more extra rotation, because you will need it because the car really likes to understeer through here. Wait a long time before getting back onto the throttle. And now over to the left-hand side for this 90 right corner, braking at the Goodyear board. So just before the Goodyear or the 50-meter board, just before those. Down to gear 1. Hook the right-hand curb to get a little bit of extra rotation. Back to throttle, letting the car run out. Again, not too far, because if you run out all the way, you'll hit that outside ball, which is suboptimal. And now you get a bit of a breather before the most irritating sector on this circuit, at least on fixed setup. You've got the Porsche curves. I'm going to take the shortest possible line on the left-hand side. And now, you want to go down 2 gears into here to get the extra rotation. Brake just under the DHL sign. Down to gear 4. Back on the throttle mid-corner. You're going to be basically playing with the throttle the entirety of this section because the car just wants to understeer when you're on the throttle. So you're going to have to take slight lifts. Obviously, that's more for the Ferrari. The Ferrari really, really understeers a lot more than most other cars on fixed. You want to use this little bump on the right-hand side just after the curb, or, well, just on this bit of the curb where it goes a little bit, I don't know how to explain it, but the colours are a little bit shorter. You can see here, at least from the perspective. There's a little bump here, and you can see that there. That's where we turn in. And tread in the car all the way around the corner. We hook a little bit of the grass here to try and get a bit of extra rotation, but unfortunately I hold on to it too long, and you'll see we have a massive snap of oversteer through here, which actually sets up really badly for this left. Ideally, you want to hook your left wheels on the curb and on the tarmac, sort of where the sausage curbs are, but unfortunately we don't manage to do that. We only lost us probably half a tenth to a tenth. And then the final chicane, you want to break out the digiboard on the right hand side, which is right here. So I'll just sort of move the camera to point in that direction where the 2 orange men are. Brake just set the digiboard down to gear 3. Hook over the curbs. Try and ideally keep as far to the right hand side as you can to set up the final chicane. We unfortunately go to the middle of the circuit, but luckily we get over the left hand curb nicely and the right hand curb. Get a bit of a slide on the exit, and that is a lap of Le Mans. Biggest trend on this lap really is just patience. You're letting the car rotate because of how understeery the setup is, and just making sure that you hook the curbs as much as possible. And let's have a look and see how that looks in Coach Dave Delta app. So the main trend you'll see on the Coach Dave Delta app, as you can see right now, is that a lot of the brake traces end very suddenly. There's not a lot of a trail period. And that's because when you brake into the corner on the fixed setup, the car tramlines a huge amount, which basically means that when you try and turn in while braking and while trail braking, the car will just understeer wide. And that's because of how amazingly high the front ride height is. It's 5.7 centimeters compared to the minimum which you usually run, which is around 5.0. So almost a whole centimeter extra front ride height and a very soft spring setup, which means that the car pitches so heavily under braking. So the car essentially, imagine the car is like this going into the corner. When you brake, it goes down like this, into the corner, which means that when you're trying to turn, all the weight is on the front end, and it just means the car will just not rotate because it's all pitching too far forward. So you've got to drive the car very differently to what you'd expect. Get all your braking done in a straight line and turn in completely while coasting with no input, because otherwise the car just overloads itself on the front tyres and gives them too much to do. Which is very unorthodox, and you're using a lot of the curbing as well to rotate the car, rather than trying to steer the car and trail the brake, because the car just doesn't rotate naturally, and you need to use the curb to do that job for you. And it's a very unique way of driving. Unfortunately, you can't really see that through the data, but if you coincide these graphs here, where the braking is very suddenly off, and then the steering is done, while we're off the brake, you can kind of understand what I'm trying to show with this. So despite it only being a 20-minute race, there's going to be huge ramifications with the tyre wear, because obviously you're on tyre warmers, which already heat your tyres up to around 80 degrees Celsius, which is around where the optimal range is. And then it being a 27-degree ambient temperature and the track being around 40 degrees, the tyres are going to overheat super quickly, even in a 20-minute race. So for that, I'd recommend the Lexus, the Ford, and the Aston Martin as the 3 main cars that I think are going to be a massive issue in these daily races. Usually I'd also shoe in the Corvette, but honestly the Corvette's rear tyres are just going to overheat within only a lap. So I think the Lexus and the Ford and the Aston are going to be the 3 massively front-running cars in this week's daily races. So there you have it. We've gone over 3 of the daily races for Le Mans Ultimate this week in the LMGT3 class, and I hope you guys found it helpful. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you're new, drop a comment down below if you have any other questions, or if you want to see any other videos on the channel. Now for Qatar and Silverstone, they are open setup races, and if you need help trying to figure out how to make the setup work for you in the best way possible, check the video on the right of your screen now to figure out how I go through a setup and make it suit my personal preferences. And best of luck in dailies this week. Take care, and bye-bye.